Mud and chaos. That's what they woke up to each day. A giant field of craters filled with water, blood, and shredded gear. Imagine stumbling through sharp wire at dawn, boots caked in sticky sludge, heart pounding so loud you can hardly think. Then, out of nowhere, an artillery shell screams overhead and slams into the earth, shaking your entire body. Men claw at the ground, diving for any scrap of cover. Deafening blasts tear through the morning air, turning dirt into massive clouds of dust and broken metal. Folks gasp for breath, throats coated in grit, eyes stinging with fear. Adrenaline floods every muscle, while rumbling cannons never seem to stop. A single cry can echo across the battlefield, sometimes a frantic shout for help, sometimes a stunned gasp as someone realizes they've stumbled into another crater. Down below, sticky mud grips at ankles like a hungry monster. Soldiers sink knee-deep, cursing the foul stench that creeps from rotting debris. The smell of burnt powder mixes with the odor of unwashed uniforms, forming a thick, nauseating haze. Every cough tastes like raw dirt. Every blink feels gritty, as if tiny shards of stone coat your eyelids. And still, the shelling continues, relentless, pounding, rattling your ribs until you almost want to scream at the sky. But in the middle of all that terror, someone in the trenches starts humming a tune. Can you believe it? Shells are crashing, bullets zip by, and a random soldier is humming like he's trying to calm a frantic cat. The sound spreads, others join in, humming or whistling odd melodies. It sounds so out of place, so surreal, as though they're trying to trick their minds into forgetting the blood-soaked mud right in front of them. Then a commander yells, "Get down, you fools!" The chorus breaks into nervous laughter. For one fleeting moment, the war feels a tiny bit less crushing. Nighttime can be even worse. Pitch-black skies hide everything. Flares pop overhead, revealing twisted barbed wire and ghostly silhouettes creeping through the gloom. Is that shape friend or foe? No one knows until it's too late. Sometimes a soldier fires blindly, only to hear a shout from his own side. Heart skip beats, hands tremble around rifles, sweat drips into eyes, stinging, blurring vision. Paranoia seeps into every breath. Each rustle could be someone crawling closer with a bayonet. Each gust of wind could be a stealthy figure brushing past the wire. Nobody sleeps soundly in this place of endless dread. Rats scurry across boots at night, bold and fearless, feasting on discarded scraps. They even chew on the remains of fallen men. Yes, it's horrifying. Troops try to swat them away with clubs or spades, but the vermin keep coming, eyes glinting in the sparse lantern light. Some rats grow so fat that they waddle around the trench floors, squeaking with a brazen, mocking tone. Soldiers curse them, throw tin cans, do anything to keep them off their precious rations. But the rats always return, as unstoppable as the daily shelling. It's madness layered on top of madness, like living in a nightmare that refuses to end. Then there's the roar of the machine guns. Imagine a line of them chattering away, spitting bullets at hundreds of rounds per minute. The barrels glow red hot, the gunners' faces slick with sweat. Spent casings pile up, still smoking. Anyone crossing into that lethal storm stands no chance. Bodies drop in seconds, tangled in barbed wire or sinking into the thick mud. Medics can't even reach them, too dangerous. They might shout from a distance, watching in helpless horror, shells still shrieking above. The ground shakes nonstop. No calm, no rest. Just a thunderous hellscape of noise. Yet, unbelievably, some soldiers carried instruments to the front. A battered violin might appear in a muddy corner. A bagpipe might suddenly wail across no man's land, stirring confusion among enemy lines. Could you imagine hearing bagpipes while gunfire echoes? It must have sounded unreal, like a bizarre carnival in the middle of death's playground. Once in a while, both sides paused for a heartbeat, trying to figure out what that strange sound was. Then the guns resumed, and the moment vanished like a weird dream. Sentries kept eyes peeled for surprise raids. They'd crouch behind sandbags, peering through the gloom, their nerves wound so tight that the slightest movement triggered a volley of shots. Sometimes it was a stray dog, skittering across the torn-up landscape. Other times, it was indeed a raiding party, creeping closer under the cover of night. Hand-to-hand fights erupted in the swirling smoke. The clash of bayonets, the desperate grunts, the flash of grenades. It was so personal, so raw. Men wrestled in muddy pits, cursing, shouting, gripping at each other's throats. Then, a flare might reveal everything for a split second, a chaotic tangle of uniforms and flailing limbs. And after that, darkness returned, leaving everyone panting and terrified. In one sector, rumors spread about a new weapon that was half tank, half fortress on wheels. Soldiers whispered about its unstoppable metal hull, thick enough to deflect artillery. Some believed it was just a rumor, but one day, a monstrous shape appeared on the horizon. Steam hissed, gears churned, and the ground shook with each turn of its tracks. Awe and fear filled the trenches. It rolled forward, unstoppable. Then, much to everyone's disbelief, it got bogged down in a huge crater full of water. The machine sputtered and sank, hatches jammed, the crew scrambling to escape. A hush fell over the battlefield, followed by bursts of laughter. Even the mighty metal beast couldn't escape the legendary mud. Spies and saboteurs added another layer of tension. Disguised as medics or traveling entertainers, they tried to slip behind enemy lines with crucial notes hidden in boots or jackets. Sometimes they got away with it. Other times, suspicious guards caught them at checkpoints. A coded telegram might be found stuffed in a bandage. The shock and shouts that followed made everyone jumpy. Who could be trusted? Paranoia seeped through the ranks, leading to sleepless nights and endless watch rotations. Soldiers found themselves eyeing their own comrades, wondering if someone's accent sounded off or if their uniform looked just a bit too new. Certain corners of the front saw bizarre truces. Imagine days of horror suddenly halted when exhausted men decided they couldn't take another second of fighting. They might wave a dirty rag as a sign to stop shooting. Stunned onlookers from the other trench might also hold their fire. Then, incredibly, these sworn enemies stepped into no man's land to collect bodies, trade cigarettes, or just catch a breath. In one instance, a football appeared. Without saying a word, men from opposing sides kicked it around, sloshing through the cratered mud, letting out anxious laughter. It was a surreal break from the constant violence. But soon enough, the officers regained control, shots rang out, and everyone dove back behind their lines, hearts pounding with the renewed madness. New soldiers fresh from training often arrived wide-eyed. They carried bright, clean uniforms, hopes of quick glory, and heroic stories swirling in their heads. Then the first shell exploded near them, rattling their illusions. The stench, the rats, the endless roar, none of it resembled those dramatic propaganda posters back home. Some froze in shock, others vomited. The veterans would pat them on the shoulder, muttering grim words of welcome. The new recruits soon discovered that the greatest victory was simply surviving another day in this hellish, waterlogged terrain. Commanders sent out bold orders from behind the lines, expecting their troops to charge through bullet storms. Many foot soldiers whispered curses about the brass who never saw the front's real horrors. Yet, sometimes, an officer insisted on leading from the front, wearing an old battered hat instead of a standard helmet. Bullets whizzed past him, shells burst overhead, but he strode on, shouting commands, refusing to duck. Troops admired his courage, but also thought he was insane. Some said he was blessed with uncanny luck. Others claimed he was too stubborn to die. Regardless, his presence lit a strange spark in his men, pushing them to advance, even when everything around them screamed, "Run away!" Clashes often happened over mere yards of land that changed hands again and again. The cost was mind-boggling. One hill could soak up 1,000 lives in a single afternoon. Trenches collapsed under heavy bombardment, burying terrified souls in damp earth. When a lull hit, survivors crawled out, shocked to see how the landscape had morphed into unrecognizable craters, with shattered tree stumps jutting out like broken teeth. All the while, generals away from the front studied maps, calculating the progress of each push. That kind of thinking, focusing on a few feet of blood-soaked ground, felt twisted. But it kept going, day after day. Gas attacks introduced a new nightmare. Without warning, a eerie cloud might drift across the field, greenish-yellow in color. Eyes burned, throats closed, men coughed uncontrollably. Some tried stuffing rags soaked in water or urine over their faces, hoping it would block the toxic fumes. Panic erupted when the wind shifted, blowing the gas back toward those who launched it. The horror was universal. Gas masks were developed in a rush, but early versions were clumsy and barely did the job. Soldiers cursed this invisible killer, the cruelest trick in an already brutal war. Still, in the midst of all this chaos, humans found bizarre ways to cling to normal life. A few insisted on shaving daily, using shards of mirrors or battered tin cups of filthy water. Others wrote letters home, ignoring the shelling as they poured their hearts onto scraps of paper. Some guys even tried to brew tea in battered kettles, stirring in lumps of sugar if they could find any. Every day was a gamble. No one knew if they'd see the next sunrise, but these tiny routines gave them a flicker of sanity. And then came the music again. Out of the gloom, a soldier would produce a harmonica, blowing a tune that mixed with the blasts. Another soldier might crack a dark joke about the generals. A third soldier would grin as he cleaned mud off his rifle. In a world where death lurked at every corner, these odd moments glowed like dim lanterns in the night, reminding everyone that they were still alive, still human, even if stuck in the craziest place imaginable. Rumbles of artillery start up once more. The air buzzes with tension. Men brace themselves, trembling slightly, checking their gear with frantic hands. A booming explosion rocks the trench, sending clumps of wet earth raining down on helmets. Nobody knows if this next barrage will be the final push or just another wave of chaos. But hearts pound, blood pumps, and a grim determination fills the air. They steel themselves for whatever nightmare is about to unfold, clinging to the hope, no matter how faint, that they might see tomorrow. And that's just scratching the surface of how truly absurd and terrifying this conflict could be. The idea of a decent night's rest sounded like a cruel joke. Imagine lying in a cramped dugout, head propped on a lumpy sack of damp straw, while your ears rang with non-stop shellfire. Every explosion made the walls tremble, flinging loose clods of dirt onto your face. Sometimes, a flickering candle revealed the scuttling forms of lice crawling across clothes and blankets. Everyone scratched, day and night. No matter how often they tried to wash or boil uniforms, those nasty bugs kept coming back, breeding in seams and collars. Soldiers scratched until their skin bled, cursing the endless torment. Odd remedies popped up among the ranks. Some rubbed grease into their hair, hoping the lice would slide off. Others burned the critters with cigarette ends. A few desperate souls shaved every patch of body hair they could reach. None of it guaranteed relief. A group of soldiers once tested a so-called miracle powder, only to find it smelled awful and seemed to attract more bugs. So there they were, itching, exhausted, covered in bites, feeling like they were losing a battle against an invisible swarm. The scratching was constant, at times more maddening than the thunder of artillery. Worst of all was the threat of trench foot. Standing for hours in stagnant water turned boots into soggy prisons, toes turning pale and wrinkled. The dampness dug into flesh, rotting it from the inside out. Men's feet swelled, ankles ached, the skin peeled in gruesome layers. A nauseating odor rose from blackened sores. In extreme cases, gangrene set in, forcing doctors to amputate. Orders came down to dry socks whenever possible. Easier said than done in a flooded hole with no place to hang anything. Some tried heating wet socks over tiny fires, but the smoke stank of sweat and scorched fabric, adding to the misery. Occasionally, a stroke of luck let troops rotate to the rear for a brief break. They trudged away from the front lines, heads drooping from fatigue, uniforms crusted with mud. Reaching a quieter zone felt surreal. Even if it was just a few miles behind the chaos, the difference was huge. They found battered huts or barns where they could peel off their filthy boots and wring out their socks. Maybe they got a ration of hot stew with chunks of actual meat. Some even managed a quick sponge bath. It felt like luxury in a world gone mad. But that relief never lasted. Sooner or later they got orders to march back to the front, loaded with fresh supplies or extra ammo. Their hearts sank each time the distant rumble of guns grew louder. As they neared the trenches, the familiar stench of decay and stale gunpowder hung in the air. A sense of dread settled over them, like a damp blanket. They slogged back into the narrow pathways, saluting any higher-ups they saw. Then they'd resume the monotonous routine, stand to at dawn, watch for enemy movements, clean rifles, and wait, always wait, for the next barrage to begin. Strangely enough, boredom was an enemy too. Between battles, the hours dragged painfully. Men played cards on improvised tables made from wooden crates. They bet scraps of chocolate or battered coins if they had any left. Some doodled on scraps of paper, sketching silly cartoons of officers or scribbling down jokes. Others sewed up holes in uniforms or carved crude figures from stray pieces of wood, anything to distract from the oppressive gloom. Now and then someone told ghost stories, making everyone laugh nervously, though real horrors lay just a few yards away. Food was a constant source of complaint and dark humor, hard biscuits that could crack a tooth if not soaked in hot tea. Bully beef that tasted like salty rubber. Soldiers joked that some tins were older than they were, possibly left over from past wars. Everyone prayed for fresh deliveries, but the supply lines often got shelled, leaving the front with moldy bread or bland stew. When a random treat appeared, like jam or condensed milk, it felt like a gift from the heavens. Men guarded their precious spoonfuls, savoring every sticky drop. Rum was another prized ration, a burning liquid that briefly numbed frayed nerves. Mail from home sparked tears and smiles. Letters were smudged and delayed, but they carried words of comfort or longing. Mothers begged their sons to stay safe. Wives pleaded for details. Sweethearts sent pressed flowers or photos. Sometimes, a father wrote that the farm was falling behind without the extra pair of hands. Other times, the letter bore tragic news. Someone had passed away. Reading that in a muddy trench cut deeper than any bayonet. Some men tore the letters to shreds in anguish. Others folded them carefully, tucking them close to their hearts. The sense of distance was crushing. You could almost feel the weight of every mile between the front and home. Casual moments took on strange forms. A soldier might crouch in a corner, vigorously polishing brass buttons to keep spirits high. Another might scribble a poem, lines twisting in and out of the reality of war. Some men swapped stories about pre-war life, describing fields of wheat under a summer sun or cozy family dinners by a warm fireplace. These memories felt like scenes from another planet, a life that existed in a dream. Yet sharing them kept hope alive, even under the constant threat of machine guns and shrapnel. In that grim existence, men developed superstitions that bordered on the bizarre. One fellow might carry a lucky rabbit's foot, swearing it saved him from certain death more than once. Another insisted on wearing the same ragged scarf for every patrol. Some believed a random snippet of song warded off sniper bullets. One group refused to step on a particular plank in the trench floor, claiming it brought bad luck. Soldiers teased each other about these rituals, but in secret, many followed their own strange habits. In a place where fate seemed cruelly random, any hint of control offered comfort, no matter how illogical. Occasionally, traveling entertainers or army concert parties arrived to boost morale. They set up a makeshift stage behind the lines, complete with battered curtains and wobbly props. Soldiers flocked there, eager for a break from the endless dread. Laughter erupted as they watched comedic skits poking fun at officers or random folks back home. A performer might juggle tin cans or recite silly poems. The crowd roared in delight, momentarily forgetting the gloom. Some men cried from laughing so hard, their eyes wet not just from joy, but from the sheer relief of feeling human again. Then, once the show ended, they trudged back to the trenches, with a faint grin lingering on their faces. Mishaps became legendary. Like that time a soldier tried to fish in a flooded crater, convinced there were actual fish in there. He fashioned a crude rod from a broken rifle barrel and some wire, letting the line dangle in the murky water. His pals teased him relentlessly, but he just shrugged and said, "Stranger things have happened here." Another day, a random goat wandered into the trenches, chewing on stray bits of cloth. No one knew where it came from, but it became a sort of mascot, until it vanished one night, probably spooked by an artillery barrage. Tales like these spread like wildfire, providing moments of odd amusement in the drab horror. The constant presence of death weighed heavily on everyone. Even the bravest soul felt the chill when a friend's name was called for a midnight patrol in no man's land. Each step beyond the wire felt like stepping into a shadowy realm where stray flares could expose you to enemy snipers. Heart pounding in your ears, breath catching in your throat, you'd move slowly, hoping your gear wouldn't rattle. The distant pop of a flare gun sent you sprawling face first into the mud, body shaking with fear as the harsh light swept across the cratered terrain. Any movement or noise could spark a hail of bullets. Sometimes a comrade never returned, leaving the rest of the unit to guess his fate. Strange alliances formed within units. Men from different backgrounds, farmers, factory workers, students, even a former stage actor, became closer than family. In the face of chaos, they shared jokes, supplies, and the same battered dugouts. Rivalries dissolved as they clung to each other for basic survival. They might argue over petty things, like who got the corner bunk or who messed with someone's rations, but when the shells started raining down, they were bound by a fierce loyalty. Many said that only the folks in your trench could truly understand the insanity of it all. Letters from home often mentioned how folks there had no clue what it was really like. War news in the papers sounded heroic or glorious, full of patriotic speeches and stirring anthems. That felt so removed from the foul smells, the endless mud, and the gruesome sights that haunted the front lines. Some men wrote back bitterly, venting their frustration. Others stayed silent, unwilling or unable to describe the truth. How do you explain the sight of a friend's face contorted in pain, or the echo of screams in the night to someone who's never set foot outside a cozy living room? Small acts of kindness took on huge significance. Maybe a soldier offered half his chocolate to a comrade who'd lost all his rations, or a medic stayed awake for days, tending wounds in a makeshift station, comforting the dying with gentle words. Even in the worst moments, humanity somehow glimmered through the gloom. A brief handshake, a pat on the shoulder, a single nod of understanding, these gestures meant everything. They reminded everyone that beyond the wire and bullets, there was still some decency left in the world. There were times when the sun peeked through the shell-shattered trees, making the mud glisten like glass. Birds might flutter overhead, strangely out of place in the midst of wreckage. For a minute, the war felt distant, like a terrible dream about to end. Soldiers would lift their heads, squint at the light, and remember life outside the trenches. Some wrote in diaries about these fleeting moments of peace, describing the color of the sky or the sound of a lone bird singing. Then an officer's bark or the whistle of incoming shells yanked them back to grim reality. The emotional toll built up day by day. Men who once cracked jokes started speaking less, their eyes hollow. Shell shock crept in, causing trembling hands, nightmares, sudden bursts of panic. Some found themselves frozen in terror at the slightest bang. Others wandered around in a daze, unable to respond to their own name. Doctors tried rushed treatments, from rest to harsh punishments, not fully understanding the psychological wounds inflicted by constant bombardment. Soldiers feared being labeled cowards if they admitted they were cracking under pressure. So they pushed it down, tried to appear strong, until the next barrage sent them spiraling again. Even so, moments of dark humor kept the spirit alive. A group might name their trench Holiday Home or Paradise Alley, painting crude signs that twisted reality into a joke. An artillery crater could be nicknamed Lake Splatter, and if a stolen bottle of wine turned up, a few men might pass it around, raising a sarcastic toast to our lovely vacation spot. Laughter wasn't just an escape, it was a shield against despair, because without it, the constant strain might just shatter a person into pieces. Hygiene was nearly impossible. If you managed to wash your face with slightly clean water, that was a major accomplishment. Some men rigged up ingenious contraptions, a bucket with holes poked in the bottom, hung from a wooden beam, to create a makeshift shower. They'd strip down to grimy undershorts, braving the cold for a precious rinse. Soap was rationed, so they ended up scrubbing themselves with whatever they had. The water quickly turned brown and foul-smelling. Still, those few minutes under the trickling water felt like a moment of pure bliss compared to the usual filth. Rifles jammed with mud, if not cleaned constantly, so weapon maintenance became a ritual. Soldiers carefully stripped their rifles, wiping every piece with an oily rag. The slightest malfunction could mean life or death during a sudden enemy raid. Grenades had to be kept dry, their pins inspected. Ammunition pouches were checked for moisture or mud caked inside. This routine might seem tedious, but it gave each man a sense of control. They couldn't stop the shells or alter the bigger strategy, but at least they could make sure their gear worked when the time came. Rumors spread like wildfire, stories of new superweapons or that the enemy was about to run out of supplies, or that peace talks were secretly underway. Each tale lit a spark of hope or dread. Often, they turned out to be nonsense, but folks clung to any possibility of this nightmare ending. Some claimed the war would be over by Christmas, except Christmas came and went, leaving everyone still trapped in the mud. Others whispered that certain generals had gone mad, scribbling insane plans in dusty offices miles away. The rumor mill kept grinding, feeding on fear and longing, and through it all, that constant artillery thunder never truly stopped. Sometimes it eased to distant booms, other times it roared in massive barrages that rattled teeth and jumbled thoughts. The whistle of incoming shells was a sound no one ever forgot. Hearts clenched in sheer terror, waiting for the impact. The waiting was almost worse than the actual blast. Would it land near you, or some poor soul down the line? Each explosion sent a shudder through the ground, and everyone prayed it wouldn't be their turn. Yet each morning, men dragged themselves up, stiff muscles protesting. They ate whatever meager breakfast they could scrape together and got ready for another day in the bizarre underworld known as the trenches. Maybe they'd survive. Maybe they'd even hear a rumor that this madness might end soon. Or maybe they'd just grit their teeth and carry on, haunted by the knowledge that the next barrage could spell the end for any one of them. And still, they pressed on, locked in a grim existence that seemed impossible to escape, clinging to whatever threads of hope they could find in the swirling gloom. Cold winds swept across shattered fields. Dark clouds gathered overhead, threatening yet another downpour of icy rain, as if the mud wasn't thick enough already. Days blurred together, and rumors drifted through the ranks. Stories of entire platoons vanishing overnight, strange lights seen beyond the barbed wire, and silent snipers picking off anyone who lingered above the parapet too long. People started feeling like they were stuck in some surreal nightmare that refused to end. At times, it hardly felt real. But the stench of wet wool and gunpowder was proof enough that this bizarre reality was all too true. Officers kept pressing for yet another push, determined to claim a few more yards of crater-ridden terrain. Men mumbled under their breath, their faces blank with fatigue. They'd seen it before. Once they hopped over the top, the shrill blasts of machine guns cut them down in heaps. It was a grim, predictable dance, repeated across countless sectors. Some soldiers tried to mask their dread by muttering curses or one-liners, but that thin humor did little to calm the frantic pounding in their chests. It felt like being trapped on a broken carousel, spinning in circles through gunfire and fear. Trench raids added a new layer of chaos. Under the cover of darkness, small squads crawled through tangles of wire, hearts hammering in their ears, knives gripped tight. Sometimes they startled dozing sentries, seizing vital papers or maps before slipping away into the night. Other times they ran face first into a well-prepared enemy, flares lighting up the sky in a sudden burst of white glare. Gunshots cracked like thunderclaps, men dove for the nearest shell hole, and confusion reigned. The survivors staggered back at dawn, covered in filth, eyes bloodshot, gulping any spare sip of water. Commanders demanded details, but the shaken raiders could only stammer about screams, muzzle flashes, and mud-soaked chaos. Artillery guns also unleashed terrifying barrages at random hours. No place felt truly safe. Soldiers might be frying some stale bacon over a tiny flame when an explosion ripped through the trench, sending bodies and debris flying. One moment, folks were chatting or dozing. The next, they were scrambling for cover, ears ringing, lungs burning from the acrid smoke. Afterward, rattled survivors helped each other dig out anyone buried beneath the collapsed walls. It was a horrifying routine, life reduced to a cycle of anxious waiting, sudden terror, and frantic rescue efforts. And once the dust settled, everyone knew the next barrage was only a matter of time. Though conditions were unspeakable, strange comforts emerged in the gloom. Smokers shared crumpled cigarettes, huddling in the lee of a trench corner to shield the flickering embers from enemy snipers. They inhaled that harsh smoke like it was precious gold, feeling a momentary calm wash over their frayed nerves. Others took solace in scribbling words in battered journals, describing the mud, the constant shell fire, and the longing for home. These little rituals were fragile lifelines in a reality that felt stripped of all normalcy. Some men confessed that writing a single paragraph by candlelight gave them a reason to endure one more day. Animals played unusual roles in the mayhem. Messenger pigeons were prized for their ability to fly above the carnage, carrying tiny capsules of crucial orders. Racing through bullets and shrapnel, these birds sometimes returned with broken wings or missing feathers, yet they persisted, flapping onward with heart-stopping courage. Dogs also roamed the trenches, dragging small carts of supplies or searching for wounded men in no man's land. Their keen sense of smell guided them to fallen soldiers lost among the craters. Even horses, though vulnerable to shell fire, remained vital for hauling artillery. Soldiers grew attached to these four-legged companions, feeling a spark of empathy in an environment dominated by constant destruction. Spy hunters grew paranoid, interrogating anyone whose accent sounded odd or whose background seemed suspicious. Even loyal soldiers found themselves questioned if they acted strange under stress. It was a tense atmosphere. Nobody wanted traitors slipping crucial info across the lines. Guards posted signs everywhere, warning men not to discuss battle plans in casual conversation. Loose talk could lead to catastrophic ambushes. Whispers claimed that undercover agents once posed as traveling magicians, sneaking behind friendly lines to gather intel while performing simple card tricks. People scoffed at such rumors, but in a war this bizarre, almost anything seemed possible. Night patrols occasionally caught glimpses of silhouettes scurrying around the bombed-out shell of a farmhouse. Some folks swore it was a secret enemy hideout. Others insisted it was just wild animals rummaging for scraps. Tension soared whenever a flare illuminated those battered ruins, revealing moving shadows. A group of scouts once crept up to investigate, only to find a frightened civilian family cowering in the rubble, trapped between warring sides. The scouts gave them some bread, pointed to a safer path, and scurried back to their lines. Encounters like that hammered home just how vast the human suffering was, far beyond just the soldiers in the trenches. Amputees and severely injured men became all too common sights. Field hospitals overflowed with casualties. Medics worked round the clock, hands shaking from fatigue. Stretcher bearers slogged through the mud, carrying the wounded to makeshift aid stations. The moans of agony left a permanent echo in every corner. Some injuries were so severe that the attending doctors could only offer morphine for comfort, knowing full well the patient wouldn't last the night. Still, they pressed on with grim determination, trying to patch up torn limbs, shattered bones, and horrific burns from gas or flamethrowers. Blood stained every stretcher, every bandage, every corner of the cramped tents. The smell of antiseptic fought a losing battle against the pervasive scent of infection and decay. Some soldiers succumbed to crushing melancholy, feeling as if the entire world was stuck in a monstrous loop of violence. Others tried to keep up morale by poking fun at the absurdities around them. One might jokingly claim that the rats were getting bigger than the recruits. Another might call the latest gas mask design a fashion statement as he clutched it to his face during a drill. This rough gallows humor was a fragile shield, helping them cope with the sheer insanity. Despite it all, every single man knew that a stray bullet or a sudden shell could rip any sense of levity to shreds in an instant. When the scorching summer arrived, the trenches baked under relentless sun, turning mud pits into foul-smelling slime that caked and cracked around boots. Flies swarmed in thick clouds, drawn by the stench of rotting debris and unburied bodies. Men waved their arms, slapped their faces, but the buzzing pests persisted. Thirst became an even bigger issue as water supplies sometimes ran short. What water they did have might taste brackish or be tinted a murky brown. Dysentery spread like wildfire, leaving soldiers writhing in pain, drained of energy. Yet the fighting pressed on, as unstoppable as the changing seasons. In winter, the cold became brutal. Frostbite chewed at fingers and toes. Breath formed icy crystals in the still air. Trenches froze solid, making it impossible to dig deeper or fix collapsed sections. Some nights, the temperature plummeted so low that rifles jammed if not properly oiled. Men wrapped themselves in thin blankets, huddling together for warmth, teeth chattering like rattling shells. Sleep was nearly impossible when your body felt like a stiff block of ice. Still, stray snowflakes occasionally drifted down, creating an eerie hush over the battlefield. For just a second, it almost looked peaceful. White flakes settling on rusted barbed wire. Then a shell would burst, sending snow and dirt flying, shattering the fragile illusion. Odd contraptions emerged to break the stalemate. Giant mortars that launched enormous shells, flamethrowers spewing liquid fire, even experimental grenades with strange designs that sometimes exploded prematurely. Soldiers watched these inventions with a mixture of awe and horror. Nobody wanted to be near a malfunctioning device. One rumor talked about a bizarre sound cannon that would rattle enemy trenches to dust using vibrations. Most folks dismissed it as fantasy, but they never ruled it out completely. After all, who would have believed a few years earlier that entire battlefields would be drenched in poison gas, or that metal beasts called tanks would crawl across cratered soil? Mail sensors combed through letters, blacking out any mention of troop movements or locations. Soldiers grumbled when they received letters with large chunks missing. Families back home felt that frustration too, never getting the full story of what their loved ones endured. But the censors insisted it was for security. In such a massive conflict, every scrap of info could be valuable to enemy intelligence. So folks learned to write in code, dropping subtle hints only understood by close relatives. A soldier might say, "The weather has been particularly chilly," which might hint at a new campaign or an unexpected delay. Creativity flourished under these constraints. Sometimes, the real shock came from glimpses of luxurious life away from the front. Traveling to a rest area, soldiers might see wealthy townsfolk sipping tea in polished cafes, wearing fine clothes, going about daily business as though war was just an echo in the distance. The contrast hit like a punch to the gut. Men with mud-streaked uniforms and thousand-yard stares felt like they'd landed on an alien planet. They'd stand there, stunned, as passers-by shot them curious or pitying glances. Many resented how normal everything looked. They returned to the trenches more convinced than ever that no one truly understood the scale of their living nightmare. In the midst of all this, some soldiers formed bonds that ran deeper than anything they'd known before. Huddled in freezing dugouts, they confessed their hopes, fears, and secrets. They teased each other with nicknames like Mud Magnet or Lucky Charm. If someone got wounded, these comrades risked everything to drag him to safety. Sometimes they prayed together or tried to celebrate a comrade's birthday by scrounging up a crumbly biscuit with a makeshift candle. That raw camaraderie became a lifeline, a tiny flame against the encroaching darkness. Even decades later, survivors recalled how those friendships felt unbreakable, forged in fire and mud. A new wave of recruits kept arriving, wide-eyed and tense. Their boots squeaked, uniforms still crisp, rifles unscuffed by grime. Veterans watched them with a mix of pity and resignation. Those fresh faces had no idea what awaited. Maybe they believed the stirring slogans or pictured themselves as heroic adventurers. Some arrived humming patriotic songs only to freeze in horror when they heard the first nearby explosion. The veterans showed them how to survive the day-to-day grind, how to keep your socks dry, how to duck properly when an artillery whistle sounded, how to ignore the smell of decay. But there was no real way to prepare someone for the psychological burden that gnawed at your mind each passing day. Snipers turned certain parts of the front into deadly zones. A single glint off a helmet or a careless peek over the trench edge could invite a precise bullet from unseen marksmen. Soldiers learned to keep their heads low, often crawling on hands and knees to avoid being spotted. Periscopes were used for scanning the horizon, though those too could become targets. The fear of a silent, unseen shot haunted many men. Some snipers were legendary for their tally of kills, rumored to haunt the same patch of battlefield daily. Units sometimes organized sniper hunts, deploying counter-snipers to flush them out. It became a lethal game of cat and mouse, waged in the eerie silence between large-scale barrages. Clerks, cooks, and other support staff faced their own nightmares. Handling mountains of paperwork about casualties, missing men, or supply shortages took a psychological toll. Imagine typing out endless lists of names, aware that these belonged to real people now lying in unmarked graves. Cooks struggled with limited ingredients, forced to stretch meager rations into something edible for hundreds of troops. They scrambled for anything to add flavor, bits of onion, bacon drippings, or even local weeds. The men might groan about the bland taste, but they also knew these cooks did their best under impossible constraints. Medical orderlies faced gruesome tasks every single day. They hauled bandages crusted with blood, disposed of amputated limbs in mass pits, and tried to comfort delirious patients rattled by fever. Their dreams turned into scenes of horror, replaying the day's carnage whenever they closed their eyes. Some tried to cope with gallows humor, joking about how the lines for sick call never ended. But the shadows under their eyes told the real story. Each dawn brought another flood of wounded, and there was never enough time, medicine, or rest. Every corner of this war seemed to hold a fresh surprise. Soldiers found themselves fighting in flooded tunnels, stumbling upon pockets of gas that lingered in low-lying areas, or forging improvised bridges out of broken doors and planks to cross shell crater ponds. Once in a while, they found odd relics from older times, a rusted sword or a battered helmet from a previous century, unearthed by the constant shelling. It felt like the earth was coughing up ghosts of wars long past. Some men joked that the ground itself was tired of swallowing so much blood, spitting up old bones and relics as a protest against humanity's endless cycle of conflict. Everyone heard tales of other fronts too. Mountain warfare, where troops battled in freezing heights, or desert campaigns with scorching heat and swirling sandstorms. Letters from friends posted elsewhere painted pictures of drastically different landscapes, but the same cruelty of modern war. No matter where they were, the fundamental truth remained. Men locked in a deadly struggle, living in filth, praying for a miracle or an end. And still, weird moments of compassion popped up unexpectedly. A soldier might crawl out to drag an injured enemy into a trench for treatment, or opposing sides, sick of the stench of death, might briefly hold their fire to let stretcher bearers collect bodies. Sometimes, a shared sense of humanity broke through the horrors, even if it lasted only minutes. Then a single shot would shatter that fragile peace, and everyone scrambled back behind their rifles, hearts pounding once more. Vultures circled overhead in some regions, drawn by the carnage. Their dark shapes glided across gray skies, a reminder of nature's indifference. Men loathed those birds, throwing rocks or firing potshots whenever they got too close. But inevitably the scavengers returned, feeding on the scattered remains in no man's land. It added another layer of raw ugliness to an already harrowing scene. Soldiers tried not to look, but sometimes curiosity or horror forced their eyes upward, and they'd see the vultures swooping low with terrifying calm. Through it all, mail and rumors kept trickling in, hinting that the war might take a turn, or that a massive offensive was in the works. Soldiers braced themselves for whatever came next, uncertain whether they preferred the numbing stalemate or the terror of a full-scale attack. The only certainty was that each day tested their sanity, each night haunted them with thunderous echoes of artillery. Yet they clung to life with a stubborn will, driven by duty, desperation, or the faintest hope that someday they'd trade these mud-soaked trenches for the warmth of home. Even if home now felt like a distant land from a half-forgotten story. Machine guns rattled at dawn. Mists swirled over cratered ground, masking every movement like a grim stage curtain. Every nerve in your body braced for the shrieking whistle that signaled the next rush. Men gripped rifles, hearts pounding, aware that once they climbed out of the trench, they'd be met with a storm of bullets. Some veterans muttered prayers or curses under their breath, their eyes locked on the swirling haze. Occasionally, a pigeon darted overhead, a tiny flutter amid the thunder of guns. It was a strange contrast, fragile wings beating in a world torn to shreds by steel and fire. Over the top they went, stumbling through sticky mud, gasping at the sudden shock of open sky. Machine gun fire hammered the air. The ground spat up dirt with each impact, some bullets ricocheting off metal fragments, others cutting men down in mid-stride. Calls for medics rose above the din, only to be swallowed by the continuous barrage. A few frantic survivors dove into shell holes, pressing their faces into the cold earth, trying to become invisible. In those fleeting seconds, the entire horizon felt like a giant, snarling beast. Shells whistled overhead, smashing into the enemy lines with roars that shook every fiber of the soul. When the push faltered, soldiers crawled back under cover, hearts still thudding, uniforms soaked in sweat and grime. Stragglers limped, dragging wounded friends, ignoring their own bruises. The battered trench felt like a twisted version of safety. But once they sank down behind the parapet, fresh orders arrived. Maybe the generals wanted a renewed attack at midday, or maybe it was time to shift positions altogether. Nobody had much choice. They obeyed, forcing themselves to stand, grabbing gear, rubbing exhausted eyes, all while the smell of gunpowder clung to their hair and clothes. In quieter moments, if any existed, folks tried to write letters describing these horrors in simple words, yet no phrase could capture the deafening blasts or the taste of blood-tinged dust. Some men didn't bother. They just stared at blank paper, pen in hand, and said nothing. A few scrawled short lines. "I'm alive, that's all I can say." Then they folded the letter, hoping it might eventually reach home. Mailbags traveled precarious routes to reach distant villages and cities, but everyone prayed for some fleeting connection with life beyond the trenches. Bravery took many forms. A runner might dash across open ground to deliver an urgent message when field telephones got knocked out by artillery. Another soldier might give up his place on a stretcher for someone more badly injured. A third might stand tall under gunfire, waving frantically to guide lost comrades to safer ground. But fear also had a strong grip. Some men broke down, sobbing uncontrollably, or huddled in a corner rocking back and forth. The unstoppable pressure squeezed hearts and minds until they cracked. Discipline sometimes meant punishing such breakdowns, though many officers understood it was the madness of war that caused them. There were no easy answers in that muddy chaos. Spiritual leaders, chaplains, or priests wandered among the troops, offering whatever comfort they could. They held hurried services, kneeling in damp earth, reciting prayers while shells fell in the distance. A few even ventured into no man's land under white flags to tend the dying of both sides. Some never returned. Others came back wide-eyed, unable to speak of what they'd witnessed. Soldiers appreciated them not just for the religious aspect, but for the sheer courage they showed by stepping into the inferno unarmed. It gave people a flicker of faith that kindness hadn't vanished completely. Artillery crews worked like possessed machines. They fed shells into roaring cannons all day, ears throbbing from the concussive blasts. Hot metal reeked of burnt oils, sweat poured down sooty faces. The ground trembled with every shot. Their targets were often just coordinates on a map, tiny squares representing enemy positions. They had little idea of the human cost on the receiving end. When counter-battery fire fell, they scrambled for cover, sometimes diving behind the very guns they operated. The cycle repeated until they ran out of ammunition or the tubes overheated. And then it started again, day after day. Trench newspapers appeared in some sectors, a quirky testament to human resilience. Soldiers wrote them by hand or typed them with battered machines, printing jokes, poems, or cartoons that poked fun at daily life. They had silly names like the Muddy Times or No Man's News. Reading these gave men a brief escape, a few moments to chuckle at jokes about the dreadful food or the latest rumor. The humor was dark, full of irony, but it helped folks bond in a place that tried its best to break them. Waterlogged supply lines sometimes delivered fresh uniforms, but they never stayed fresh for long. The moment you stepped back into that sodden trench, muddy water sloshed around your ankles, splattering up to your knees. The new uniform quickly turned the same lifeless color as everything else. Helmets got dented from shrapnel, boots wore out fast on the uneven terrain, and gloves, if you had them, tore apart at the seams. Soldiers improvised repairs using scraps of canvas or bits of wire. Pride in appearance gave way to simple necessity, whatever kept you warmer, drier, or safer for just a few hours. Enemy listening posts presented another weird threat. Men were warned to keep quiet during lulls because the opposing side might have placed secret devices underground to pick up even the faintest sounds. Some said you could hear the enemy digging in certain areas, and they likely could hear you too. Patrols were sent to investigate suspicious noises, tiptoeing through labyrinths of half-collapsed tunnels. The claustrophobic darkness down there was stifling. A single lantern cast eerie shadows on dripping walls. Sometimes the tunnels caved in from distant explosions, trapping anyone unlucky enough to be inside. A chilling rumor suggested entire squads got lost in these subterranean mazes, never resurfacing. There was a macabre sort of trade that happened at times. Soldiers on opposing sides might toss packets of cigarettes or small tokens across the wire, a silent gesture of shared misery. This didn't happen often, but when it did, it made men question why they were trying to kill each other in the first place. One evening, a soldier found a note pinned to a piece of wood. It said, "Too cold for fighting tonight. We'll keep our heads down if you do too." No signature, just a tiny scrawl. As darkness closed in, both sides stayed unusually quiet, each half expecting a trick. But nothing happened. For that single night, the guns took a rest. Exhaustion wore down even the toughest souls. Eyelids drooped during guard duty, risking sudden death if a hidden raiding party crept forward. Officers tried all sorts of methods to keep men alert. Extra coffee rations, rotating shifts, harsh punishments for dozing off. But when your body is beyond tired, sometimes it shuts down anyway. Snoring could lead to a swift elbow in the ribs from a fellow sentry, or worse, a bullet if an enemy scout caught you unaware. It was an endless battle against fatigue, fought alongside the bigger battle raging overhead. Gas mask drills became routine, almost second nature. At the first sign of that sickly greenish fog, men fumbled for their masks, strapping them on while cursing the stifling rubber and the smell of stale filters. Some masks had eye lenses that fogged up instantly, so you could barely see a foot in front of you. Yet that was better than inhaling the toxic cloud that scorched lungs and melted flesh. Soldiers heard stories of entire companies found lifeless in the same position, masks not fitted correctly, or gas canisters seeping through flimsy cloth. That fear kept them vigilant, especially on days when the wind direction changed without warning. Trench raids sometimes yielded bizarre spoils. Soldiers might snatch enemy helmets or flags as trophies. Others grabbed personal items, letters, photographs, or diaries. Later, they might flip through those items, curious about the enemy's life. It often turned out that the enemy was a normal person too, someone with a family waiting back home, someone who enjoyed the same songs or had the same fears. These moments made the war feel both more human and more tragic, underscoring the shared pain on both sides of the wire. Weather punished everyone. Torrential rain turned trenches into brown rivers. Sleet stung exposed skin, hail pounded makeshift huts. Summer heat baked the wounded, leaving them delirious on the dusty boards of stretcher stations. Men collapsed from heat stroke when forced to carry heavy packs in blazing sun, uniforms soaked in sweat. None of that stopped the artillery, though. The guns kept roaring through every season, as dependable as the sunrise. Bursts of quiet sometimes descended, and that silence was almost scarier than constant bombardment. Men would glance at each other, hearts racing, expecting a sudden surprise attack. The tension made it hard to breathe. In those eerie moments, you could hear the faint drip of water in the trench drains or the distant cough of someone behind the lines. Then an abrupt crack of a sniper rifle or the rattle of machine gun fire shattered the quiet, making everyone jump. Fear coiled tighter with each false calm, leaving nerves frayed like old rope. Fresh propaganda posters showed smiling soldiers in crisp uniforms, bravely charging forward without a speck of mud on them. This angered many frontline troops who felt it was an outright lie. Where was the choking smoke, the blood, the heartbreak? Civilians back home were fed stories of glory and patriotism, but not the reality of rotting corpses half buried in collapsed trenches. Some men tore down or defaced those posters whenever they saw them, scribbling sarcastic comments about honorable mud baths or valiant lice. It was a small act of rebellion in a war that devoured free will on both sides. Medical staff tried every new treatment they could think of: mustard baths for burns, unknown chemical salves for wounds, experimental bandages that supposedly reduced infection. Sometimes these worked miracles. Other times they worsened the injuries or sparked raging fevers. Soldiers joked bitterly about being test subjects, but many saw no other choice. The front was a giant open-air hospital in some spots, with moaning men lying on stretchers lined up in rows. Some prayed for quick evac to a proper field hospital, only to learn those too were overflowing. Interviews with prisoners provided glimpses into enemy trenches. They faced the same filth, the same disease, the same dread of artillery. One captive described how his officers threatened severe punishments for anyone refusing to go over the top. Another admitted he'd rather be captured than keep living in the trenches. Such testimonies were a grim reminder that both sides were trapped in a monstrous loop, each viewing the other as the villain while living identical nightmares. Intelligence officers took notes, searching for any strategic advantage, but the raw humanity of those confessions shook even the most hardened listeners. Rumors of new offensives set everyone on edge. Whispers that thousands of fresh troops would flood the front, or that entire divisions might attempt a massive breakthrough. Men speculated about potential routes, bracing for yet another savage push through mortar fire. Anxiety gnawed at them. Would this be the final big battle, or just another wave of bloodshed for a few more yards of worthless mud? Restless nights passed in a blur, men unconsciously gritting their teeth so hard they woke with aching jaws. Ammo trains and convoys sometimes got ambushed near the front lines, turning supply roads into flaming wrecks. The glow of burning fuel lit up the night sky, revealing black silhouettes running frantically for cover. Reinforcements that arrived too late found the wreckage still smoldering, bodies scattered along the roadside. The smell of scorched metal and rubber mixed with the ever-present odor of explosives. Letters, personal belongings, even crates of medical supplies all lay strewn about, ruined. Soldiers rummaged through the debris, hoping to salvage something useful. Cans of food, a box of bandages, anything. These disasters fueled anger and despair in equal measure. Some troops found short reprieves behind the lines, in battered farms or commandeered mansions repurposed as billet stations. There they might strip off muddy uniforms, attempt a tepid bath, and grab a real hot meal. A few wrote home optimistically, claiming the war might not last much longer, though deep down they knew better. A tune from a half-broken piano might echo across a makeshift dining hall, bringing tears to the eyes of men who remembered dancing with sweethearts or singing around a family table. But soon enough, orders came through, sending them right back to the inferno. One day, a new wave of planes buzzed overhead, biplanes armed with small bombs or cameras for reconnaissance. Troops gawked at these airborne machines, half amazed and half terrified. Anti-aircraft guns spat clouds of shrapnel into the sky, trying to bring them down. Sometimes a plane spiraled to the ground in a twisted sheet of flames and black smoke. Other times it soared away, having captured vital photos of enemy positions. This was modern warfare at its strangest, flying contraptions scanning the muddy front from a vantage once reserved for birds. And through it all, the unending sorrow. Graves dotted nearby fields, rough wooden crosses marking final resting places. Some bodies were never identified, buried hastily under shell fire. The living tried to honor the dead with small ceremonies whenever possible, but the constant drum of war overshadowed any sense of closure. Every morning the ranks formed up again, usually with a few more empty spots, and the guns thundered on, ignoring the heartbreak. People wrote diaries that captured the day-to-day details. Notes about the stale bread at breakfast, the color of the sunrise, a friend's joke, or a passing comment from an officer who still believed in swift victory. These diaries preserved the unfiltered reality in messy scrawl, the terror, the boredom, the fleeting bursts of laughter, the tears, and the suffocating sense that tomorrow would be just like today, only with fewer survivors. Some hoped these records might help others understand what truly happened here. Others wrote simply to stay sane. At night, the front erupted with flares, tracer rounds, and the glow of distant fires. A soldier huddled in a corner, nibbling on hard biscuits, counting the hours until dawn. Another soldier picked mud off his boots, remembering how his mother used to scold him for dirty shoes back home. Another typed a field report by lantern light, pressing shaky fingers on the keys. Meanwhile, rats scuttled along the trench walls, scavenging scraps. The overwhelming darkness threatened to swallow all hope, but men hung on by a thread, determined to see another sunrise, no matter how bleak. And that was the bitter truth. Each new dawn brought the same routine of screams, smoke, and thunder. The war machine chewed up any illusions of romance or glory, but in the face of it, small gestures of kindness, jokes shared between trenches, or a single line in a letter from home could still keep a spark alive in someone's eyes. Despite the filth, the fear, and the endless roar of artillery, they pressed on, battered but still breathing, waiting for the day this nightmare might finally collapse under its own cruelty. Shrapnel rained down like metal hail. Fire lit the night skies, turning shadows into frantic, dancing shapes. Tunnels rumbled below the ground as if the earth itself was groaning under the weight of war. Sappers in those tunnels listened for enemy picks chipping away at the walls, praying they wouldn't be buried alive by a sudden explosion. Morale teetered on a knife's edge. Some men snapped at the smallest annoyance, hollering at each other over trifles. Others sank into eerie silence, staring into space as artillery shells pounded the horizon. The entire front felt like a stretched rubber band, ready to snap at any second. Stories spread of bizarre military units. One rumor spoke of shock troops trained to storm enemy trenches with savage efficiency. They carried special clubs, spiked helmets, and wild determination. Whether the tales were true or half-invented, the rumor alone planted dread in the minds of frontline soldiers. Another strange tale mentioned a unit of cyclists pedaling into battle on reinforced bikes, weaving through cratered paths with insane speed. Some folks laughed, saying it was obviously nonsense, but others swore they had glimpsed figures on two wheels racing past barbed wire to deliver crucial messages. The front inspired so many weird accounts, nobody could say for sure which were real. Special sniper duels became legendary. Elite marksmen stalked each other for days, changing positions constantly, camouflaging themselves with mud, leaves, or torn cloth. A single glint from a scoped rifle could invite a bullet from half a mile away. These duels forced everyone else to hug the trench floor, afraid to poke their heads up. Now and then you'd see a battered helmet stuck on a rifle, raised like bait above the parapet. Snipers might waste precious rounds shooting at that decoy, revealing their nest for a split second. Then the countershot came, brutal, swift, and final. Soldiers watched such deadly contests with a mix of awe and terror, knowing they were helpless bystanders in a silent chess game of life and death. When men couldn't endure another second of tension, improvised entertainment erupted. Someone strummed a beat-up guitar, another banged on empty ration tins, and a third tried to whistle a tune, though it usually got drowned out by distant shellfire. A few daring souls performed silly sketches, pantomiming their officers or cracking jokes about cold stew. Crowded around a flickering lantern, the audience cheered, hollered, and slapped muddy thighs. For those brief moments, they almost forgot the moans echoing from the medical station or the machine gun chatter rolling across no man's land. Laughter felt like a stolen luxury in a place where joy seemed extinct. Shattered villages behind the lines served as rest stops. Roofs were blown away, walls riddled with bullet holes, and rubble choked the streets. Soldiers claimed squatters' rights in half-bombed houses, setting up cots in corners where the rain didn't drip through. Some rummaged for anything usable: kitchen pots, leftover blankets, maybe a hidden stash of preserves left by fleeing families. The quiet in those ruined places felt eerie, like ghosts hovered in every doorway. The wind whistled through smashed windows, carrying the faint stench of old gunpowder. Now and then a cat appeared from the wreckage, meowing for scraps. Or an old well was discovered, the water still drinkable, offering a small mercy to parched throats. Along the eastern edges of the conflict, winter froze entire divisions in place. Snow piled waist-high, turning trenches into slippery ice troughs. Men layered every scrap of cloth they could find: 2 shirts, a thin coat, maybe a second pair of trousers. Frostbite crept into toes, turning flesh numb, then black. Firewood was scarce, so they burned anything flammable. Broken furniture, crates, sometimes entire barns if they dared. The swirling snow muffled artillery blasts, giving the illusion of calm. But beneath that blanket of white, men crouched with rifles in numb fingers, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. When the shelling resumed, it felt even more startling, the booms echoing off frozen hills like rolling thunder. In certain sectors, gas attacks were followed by horrifying storms of liquid fire. Flamethrowers roared like dragons, spewing streaks of burning chemicals across bunkers and barbed wire. Thick smoke billowed into the sky, carrying the stench of scorched metal and charred earth. Troops panicked, stumbling over each other to escape the searing heat. Gas masks provided no help against flames, and frantic men patted their own uniforms, terrified of catching fire. The mental scars lingered long after the flames died down. Whenever someone mentioned flamethrowers, even the toughest veterans blanched, recalling the shrieks of those unlucky enough to be caught in that inferno. The home front sometimes clashed with the realities of the trenches. Politicians gave stirring speeches about honor and duty, but rumors drifted that many of them stayed far away from the bullets. Meanwhile, families sent care packages stuffed with socks, letters, maybe a homemade cake. Soldiers devoured these treats in minutes, the taste of real food reminding them of better days. Some postcards featured cheerful scenes, flower gardens, sunny parks, people smiling in fancy clothes. That contrast stung like an open wound, highlighting how drastically life had changed for those stuck in the mud. Rumor had it, a handful of fortune-tellers or mystics tried to predict the outcome of battles, setting up stalls near transport hubs. They read tea leaves or crystal balls, offering glimpses of victory or long life. Some soldiers found it laughable, but others parted with hard-earned coins just for a shred of optimism, no matter how silly. A few cunning frauds sold lucky charms, claiming they protected against bullets. When someone wearing such a talisman got wounded anyway, those charms ended up trampled in the mud, lost among shell casings. Animals, once again, proved their worth. War horses braved barbed wire and mortar craters, pulling wagons full of supplies or dragging artillery guns through thick sludge. Many collapsed from exhaustion or got mired so deep they had to be put down mercifully. Mules carried ammo up narrow trails, their braying echoing through ravines. Some sectors trained dogs to deliver messages, sneaking through the chaos with small tubes attached to collars. On rare occasions, both sides held fire if they spotted a terrified animal caught in no man's land. An unspoken respect for innocent beasts sometimes superseded orders from above, at least for a fleeting moment. Captured deserters told stories of entire companies who simply refused to fight, throwing down rifles and marching away. Court-martials cracked down hard on such insubordination, but whispers persisted. Some men felt they had endured enough. Too many months of bombings, too many friends lost in muddy graves. With no end in sight, they snapped. Others just slipped off in the night, blending with refugees in battered towns. Wherever they went, the war's shadow loomed. Military police hunted them, propaganda posters labeled them cowards, and the front lines rumbled on, seemingly unaffected by a few lost souls vanishing into the gloom. Chemical experiments continued, with new gas formulas tested on unsuspecting trenches. Soldiers coughed blood, eyes burning from acrid fumes. Some collapsed in agonizing convulsions. Even if they survived, the damage to lungs and nerves could be permanent. Scientists in distant labs tinkered with formulas as though this was some grand experiment, ignoring the screams echoing from the front. Soldiers resented this with a fiery rage. They weren't rats in a cage. They were ordinary people shoved into extraordinary horror, left to endure the whim of technologies advancing too fast for anyone's good. Mobile field kitchens tried to boost morale with hot meals. Steam rose from giant pots of watery stew, the smell drawing hungry troops like moths to a flame. Even if it tasted bland, at least it was warm. Soldiers lined up, tin cups in shaky hands, eager for a break from the endless monotony of hard biscuits. Kitchen crews did their best, hauling sacks of potatoes or barley amid constant shell fire. Once in a while they managed a surprise dish, maybe a bit of fresh meat or a handful of onions donated by a local farm. Such tiny treats sparked chatter all through the trenches, as though it were a royal feast. Some generals still clung to outdated cavalry tactics, ordering mounted charges that ended in gruesome failure against machine guns. Horses and riders fell en masse, their splendid uniforms soon smeared with mud and gore. Younger officers shook their heads in frustration, muttering that the world had changed and these old methods belonged in the past. But the chain of command was rigid, and many men died following orders that common sense deemed suicidal. Gossip traveled quickly among the ranks, calling certain high-ups stuck in glory days, unwilling to see the stark realities of modern warfare. In corners of the front, Allied units from different countries struggled to communicate. A mishmash of languages echoed, a bit of English, French, Italian, Russian, or other tongues. Misunderstandings led to comedic mix-ups sometimes, like squads being sent to the wrong sector because someone misheard an officer's directions. But unity also grew from shared hardship. Soldiers swapped bits of each other's language, pointing, gesturing, learning basic words. They told jokes using pantomime, shrugging in confusion, then bursting into laughter when the meaning finally clicked. It was a sliver of togetherness amid the swirling chaos. Propaganda leaflets dropped from planes encouraged enemy troops to surrender, promising food and safety. Some men actually gathered these leaflets, reading them for signs of weakness or possible bargains. Others used them as toilet paper or fire kindling, scoffing at the idea that any pamphlet could rewrite their fate. Yet now and then, a battered soldier reached a breaking point, stuffing one of those flyers in his pocket before sneaking across the lines with hands raised. Nobody could blame him. When reality becomes a never-ending horror show, any exit might seem better than the status quo. Covert operations near coastlines use small boats or even primitive submarines to sneak behind enemy lines. Missions ranged from gathering intelligence to blowing up supply depots. One daring tale told of divers planting charges on a key bridge, swimming in freezing water while dodging searchlights. If successful, they'd delay enemy reinforcements for days. If caught, they'd face immediate execution. Soldiers listening to these stories around a dim lantern felt equal parts admiration and dread, unable to imagine creeping through pitch-black water under constant threat, yet aware that their own daily reality was just as terrifying in a different way. Mail from families carried personal battles, children falling ill, crops failing, businesses struggling under the strain of war. Soldiers yearned to help, but were trapped, forced to watch their loved ones suffer from afar. Some tried sending money or advice, but everything moved so slowly that solutions arrived too late. News of a birth back home sparked bittersweet celebrations. A proud father might break into tears, hugging a comrade, suddenly aware he might never hold his newborn child in his arms. Everyone else patted him on the back, offering shaky smiles and silent prayers for his survival. Field surgeries under gaslight were nightmares in themselves. Doctors in blood-stained aprons, lacking proper supplies, raced to save lives. Ether and chloroform were rationed, so some patients got minimal anesthesia, if at all. Bullet extractions and amputations sometimes happened. Everyone kept a fragile grip on that spark, bracing themselves for the next thunderous salvo that might rip it away without warning. Because in this world, everything could change with the crack of a rifle or the roar of a mortar at any second. Bodies and mud. That sight became normal. Soldiers trudged across crater fields, stepping over broken rifles and splintered bones. Sometimes, a tattered boot stuck out of the muck, marking a place where someone had been swallowed by shell blasts. The smell of decaying flesh mingled with gunpowder, a stench so thick you could practically taste it. Men tried tying handkerchiefs over their noses, but it made little difference. Flies droned around everything. Buzzing clouds swarmed over open wounds and scraps of discarded rations. Folks got used to waving them away every few seconds. Even a small cut risked infection from those filthy insects. Constant thunder rolled across the lines, shaking the ground day and night. Sleep turned into a luxury. When you did finally nod off, it was often in a damp corner with rats skittering by. Dreams morphed into nightmares of mortar rounds and falling debris. Waking up didn't feel much better, because the real world was just as horrifying. New recruits arrived with shaky hands, trying to act brave. Veterans eyed them with pity, remembering their own lost innocence. Shell shock haunted many. A sudden bang could send a man diving for cover, even if it was just a door slamming. Some men twitched uncontrollably or muttered nonsensical phrases, eyes darting around as though ghosts hovered at the edge of their vision. Further down the line, artillery specialists hammered away at enemy emplacements. Enormous cannons belched fire and smoke, each recoil jolting their metal frames. Crews plugged their ears with dirty rags, still going half-deaf from the blasts. Shell cases piled up like monstrous brass hills, still hot to the touch. If an enemy counterattack hit, Those same guns had to be quickly repositioned or risk capture. Soldiers tugged ropes, heaved wheels, and cursed at the weight of machinery. Powder burn stained their uniforms, and the tang of sulfur clung to their skin. Rear areas weren't always safe. Spotter planes circled overhead, dropping bombs on supply lines or rest camps. Some bombs were crude contraptions, tossed by hand from the cockpit. Others were more sophisticated, with timers. When sirens or horns signaled an incoming raid, everyone rushed for whatever cover they could find: a ditch, a ruined wall, or a half-collapsed barn. The dull thud of explosions rattled your chest, sending dust and debris in all directions. Afterward, stunned survivors emerged to find crates smashed and wagons burning. The worst part was knowing the front still demanded supplies, no matter how many times the convoys got hit. Medical staff encountered freak injuries that defied belief. Men with entire sections of uniform fused to their skin by hot metal shards. Others came in with bones shattered like glass. Field doctors had limited tools: scalpels, bandages, morphine if they were lucky. They learned to improvise with whatever was on hand. A chunk of wood served as a splint, a piece of wire as a suture clamp. Blood transfusions were still experimental. Some brave souls volunteered to donate their own blood directly, needle to needle, praying infections wouldn't kill them both. Every hour brought more stretchers, more frantic pleas from medics, lacking time to comfort the dying. Yet still they tried, pressing a hand to a trembling shoulder, whispering words of reassurance, even if it was obvious the patient wouldn't last. Propaganda reached absurd levels. Posters showed the enemy as savage beasts, or claimed victory was mere days away. Soldiers scoffed at these claims, but the official messages kept pouring in. Civilians back home cheered for triumph, not realizing how many thousands were lost in single battles. Meanwhile, entire towns near the front lines emptied out, buildings left to crumble under shell fire. Refugees roamed half-destroyed roads, pushing carts piled with blankets and valuables. Their faces hollow, eyes filled with a fatigue that went deeper than physical exhaustion. Tanks rumbled onto the scene in greater numbers. Early models sputtered and broke down, but newer versions plowed through barbed wire and kept going even under machine gun fire. Crews inside those metal beasts endured sweltering heat, fumes from the engine, and deafening clangs as bullets pinged off the hull. If a shell hit just right, the tank could turn into a fiery coffin. But when they worked, they terrified the opposition, rolling forward like unstoppable monsters. Soldiers followed behind them, using the hulking machines as moving cover. In a war choked by trench stalemates, these armored giants offered a hint of a new kind of fighting, faster, more mobile, and utterly shocking to those used to static lines. Aerial dogfights became a daily spectacle overhead. Pilots soared in flimsy biplanes, guns mounted on the nose or the wings. They performed acrobatic loops, diving at each other with blazing tracer rounds. On the ground, troops gawked as planes spiraled in smoky trails, sometimes colliding in midair or crashing in distant fields. Downed pilots who survived the jump were sometimes taken prisoner and treated with a strange respect. After all, it took guts to fly those death traps. But that courtesy ended if they were believed to have bombed hospitals or civilian convoys. Then mercy ran out. War's brutality played out in every domain: land, sky, and occasionally sea. Rumors circulated about entire regiments wiped out by influenza. The so-called Spanish flu ravaged armies already weakened by malnutrition and stress. Coughing fits spread through cramped dugouts, fevers soared, and men collapsed even without enemy bullets. Makeshift infirmaries overflowed, and the medics were overwhelmed yet again. Face masks popped up, not just for gas, but also for disease control. Some believed the war itself might end simply because too many were dying from sickness. But the fighting ground on regardless, and the flu became just another plague to endure. Political unrest simmered in various nations. News trickled in that hunger riots broke out in certain cities, or that revolutions toppled old governments. Soldiers at the front wondered if these changes would finally halt the madness, but high command insisted on fresh offensives instead. Tension rose to a fever pitch. Some men started to question why they still fought. Others just clenched their teeth and obeyed, feeling trapped by duty or fear of punishment. Letters from home hinted at desperate conditions: empty markets, ration lines stretching for blocks. Yet each day the war demanded more from everyone. Spy mania grew, leading to crackdowns on random folks suspected of espionage. Civilians near the front might be interrogated or even jailed if they were caught with a suspicious document. A single note in a foreign language could spark panic. Soldiers found it ironic. Entire cities lay in ruins, but the authorities worried about coded messages hidden in a grocery list. Some unfortunate souls got branded as traitors simply because they had an accent or looked untrustworthy. It was a grim reflection of how paranoia thrived amid chaos. Bright metal medals pinned on uniforms offered a twisted contrast to the filth. A soldier might receive a commendation for bravely holding a trench, only to be sent right back into the line the next day. Some pinned medals on battered overcoats, the ribbons grimy and torn. They wore them less out of pride and more as a reminder that at least someone noticed their struggle, if only for a moment. The real prize everyone craved was to see peace. Medals were cold comfort in a place where survival was the ultimate achievement. Barrages sometimes rolled for days at a time, a tactic known as the creeping barrage. Artillery advanced its range in small increments, forcing defenders to stay hidden in bunkers. Attackers then tried to follow closely behind the shell bursts, hoping to catch the enemy off guard. Coordinating this was nightmarish, especially if communications failed. Sometimes shells fell short, hitting the attackers themselves. Confusion reigned on both sides. Thunder, smoke, and dirt filled the air, making it impossible to see more than a few feet. Men tripped over wire, stumbled into enemy trenches, or got lost in the swirling dust. When the barrage finally lifted, the battlefield looked like a moonscape, littered with craters and scraps of twisted metal. Horses and mules died in staggering numbers. Their carcasses, bloated and swarmed by flies, dotted the roads and fields. Soldiers who cared for these animals felt genuine heartbreak, knowing how crucial they were to the war effort. Veterinary units did their best, but they couldn't keep up with the injuries and diseases that swept through stables. Sometimes men risked their own lives to pull a wounded horse to safety. Other times a single bullet ended the suffering. The smell from these mass graves lingered for miles, a grim testament to how the war consumed humans and beasts alike. Commanders tried new forms of communication, such as signal lamps or even early radio sets. But radio equipment was bulky and often unreliable. Signal teams scrambled up observation posts to flash coded messages, which could be intercepted by enemy watchers. Motorbike couriers wove through shell-pocked roads at breakneck speeds, hoping to deliver orders before a stray bomb or sniper ended their run. Wires got cut, messengers went missing, confusion piled up. Entire offensives sometimes stumbled because one vital message never reached the front lines in time. Behind the trenches, sabotage squads targeted rail lines and munitions dumps. Explosions lit up the night, accompanied by frantic shouts and bursts of gunfire. Civilians caught near these attacks panicked, grabbing children and scrambling for cover. Any large depot became a prime target. Soldiers detailed to guard them faced nerve-shattering boredom, never knowing if a covert strike might blow everything sky high. The tension wore on their minds. Some stood watch for days on end, scanning for suspicious movements among the rubble. Social divides back home widened as the rich avoided conscription through connections or simply left the country for health reasons. Meanwhile, working-class families sent multiple sons to the front. This sparked bitter resentment among troops who felt the burden wasn't shared equally. Newspapers printed stories of lavish parties in distant cities, while the men in the trenches ate canned meat and stale bread. That anger simmered, fueling anti-elite sentiments that sometimes erupted in harsh letters or graffiti scrawled on trench walls. Small miracles did occur. On rare occasions, an artillery shell turned out to be a dud, landing harmlessly in the mud. Soldiers might pose beside it for a photo, giving a thumbs up or writing mocking messages on the metal casing. A random lull in the gunfire allowed someone to rescue a wounded comrade trapped in no man's land. Or a letter from home arrived on a particularly bleak morning, lifting spirits enough to face another day. These flickers of hope felt precious, like tiny sparks in a forest of darkness. Engineers raced to repair roads for supply trucks, but the constant shelling undid their work almost as fast as they built it. Bridges were especially vulnerable, often rigged with explosives by both sides. Civilians still living in the war zone hovered in cellars, risking their lives to fetch water from battered wells or to salvage leftover scraps of grain. The front was so fluid in certain areas that people didn't even know which army was in control from one day to the next. Fear became a constant companion, gnawing at the nerves like an ever-present rat. When fresh contingents from overseas arrived, they brought new energy and a fresh dose of horror once they encountered the reality of trench life. Some foreign soldiers wore different uniforms or carried unique gear, sparking curiosity among their allies. But after a week in the mud, everyone looked the same, dirty, exhausted, eyes ringed with sleepless nights. Language barriers led to strange misunderstandings, yet the shared conditions overrode most differences. A grunt of sympathy or a simple handshake could bridge entire cultures in that grim pit of war. The black market trade blossomed around the front. Locals who were bold enough to sneak through shell-cratered fields might sell eggs or spirits at outrageous prices. Soldiers pooled their pay to buy a few stolen luxuries, maybe a swig of real whiskey or a fresh apple. Commanders frowned on this, but it was nearly impossible to stop. The men craved any reminder of normal life. Even a bite of fresh fruit could lift morale for an hour or two, overshadowing the daily gloom. But danger always lurked. One unlucky mortar shell could end a deal in a flash of smoke and splinters. Sometimes entire trench systems flooded after heavy rains, water rising past waist level. Men scrambled to save ammo and kit from being ruined. Floating debris drifted past, including broken boards or even bodies dislodged from shallow graves. In such floods, diseases spread faster. Dysentery, cholera, and other illnesses feasted on weakened soldiers. Medical officers did their best, urging everyone to boil water, but resources were scarce. A single gulp of contaminated rainwater could leave a soldier bedridden for days, racked with fever and cramps. Command structures kept rotating units in and out of the line, trying to give some relief. But relief was often just another battered sector a few miles away. Men joked that the only true rest was a blighty wound, an injury bad enough to send you home, but not so severe that you'd die or lose a limb. Some even contemplated shooting themselves in the foot to escape the madness. This was a risky gamble. If discovered, they faced severe punishment for self-inflicted wounds. That underscored the sheer desperation gripping many, when even harming yourself seemed like a viable way out of the slaughter. Mechanics tinkered with vehicles in muddy workshops, trying to keep trucks and motorbikes running. Spare parts were in short supply, so they improvised, cannibalizing wrecks, hammering bent frames back into shape. Oil slicks on the ground shimmered under lantern light. The sound of rattling engine parts echoed down makeshift roads. If a vital supply truck broke down, an entire platoon might go hungry that night. Pressure was high, tempers short. Whenever someone managed to fix a stubborn engine, cheers erupted, as though they'd scored a victory over the chaos itself. And still, every sunrise glowed red with the smoke of fresh shelling. The world seemed to revolve around that bitter, endless cycle. Soldiers braced for the morning bombardment, rifles clenched, hearts heavy. The rancid odor of stale water and rotting flesh mingled with the new day's breeze. Crows circled overhead, cawing at the carnage below. Anyone daring to peek over the trench rim saw fields churned into shapeless muck, dotted with puffs of black smoke. It felt like the landscape itself was weeping, unable to handle any more blood-soaked misery. No matter how horrifying the day was, the night brought its own terrors. Stealth raids, gas drifting on a quiet wind, or random bursts of machine gun fire ripping through the darkness. Sleep came in fits, if at all. Some men propped themselves on rifles, dozing in short jolts, half hoping to dream of home for a few precious minutes. Others just stared at the sky, counting distant stars, imagining their families doing the same somewhere far away. A new barrage might yank them back to the pit of reality with ear-splitting fury. Then, once again, everyone crouched in the mud, cursing fate as they clung to battered helmets, praying not to be blown to pieces. Even so, they held on. Each person had a reason, maybe loyalty to a friend, maybe thoughts of a lover's letters, or maybe just raw stubbornness. Some had nowhere else to go, no future except the next sunrise. They forced themselves to keep breathing, to keep loading rifles, to keep fighting off the suffocating despair. Because in this twisted realm of barbed wire and crater lakes, survival meant defiance. And no matter how many shells exploded or how many waves of sickness passed through, a few hearts still found the will to beat, refusing to give up, at least not yet. Shell craters turned into makeshift graves. Soldiers crouched behind shattered walls, scanning the horizon for signs of an approaching onslaught. One day might pass quietly, with only the dull echoes of distant guns. Then, out of nowhere, a massive barrage pounded the trenches, ripping apart sandbags and tossing bodies like rag dolls. Mud-splattered faces blinked through drifting smoke, ears ringing, hearts in their throats. Survivors stumbled through the carnage, pulling wounded comrades toward any scrap of shelter. Blood trickled into the sludge, swirling in murky puddles that coated the ground from one end of the trench line to the other. New orders sometimes arrived at the very last minute. "Pack up! Shift 2 miles east!" Grumbling under their breath, troops wrestled with crates of ammunition, rotting planks, and half-assembled tents. Rain hammered down, turning every path into a slippery bog. Mules brayed, struggling to drag carts full of mortar shells across terrain pocked with shell holes. Sometimes the wheels snapped, flinging supplies all over. Soldiers cursed, picking through the mud to salvage whatever they could. Then they marched on, water sloshing in their boots, because orders were orders. Pride, protest, or logic meant nothing to the unstoppable grind of the front. Out on no man's land, fragments of barbed wire glinted under cloudy skies, rust mixing with dried blood. A breeze rattled the twisted coils as snipers patiently watched for any careless movement. Even a helmet peeking above the parapet could draw a fatal shot. Troops carried wire cutters on night raids, trying to carve a path through those deadly fences. Often they tripped alarms. Flashing flares erupted overhead, revealing every crouching figure. Machine guns blazed, and any chance of surprise vanished in a hail of bullets. Panic spread among the raiders, each man diving for the nearest crater, praying not to get shredded. Somewhere behind the lines, engineers experimented with heavier guns, setting them up on railway platforms. These behemoths could lob shells for miles, shaking towns far behind the front. Civilians in once peaceful areas now jolted awake at midnight to the boom of artillery that nobody had expected to reach them. Windows shattered, rooftops caved in, and trembling families huddled in basements. Soldiers near those monster guns wore ear protectors, or stuffed cotton in their ears, yet still felt their bones vibrate with each earth-shaking shot. The recoil alone could shove the entire rail car a few feet backward. When enemy planes targeted these guns, massive dogfights erupted overhead, tracer rounds lighting up the clouds in brief, fiery arcs. Some nights, entire sections of trench flickered with eerie lantern light as chaplains led prayers for the fallen. Helmets came off, heads bowed, though half the men kept one eye open, afraid of a surprise attack. Gunfire sometimes rattled in the distance, cutting through murmured amens. Afterward, bodies were wrapped in torn blankets or sheets of canvas, carried by weary pallbearers to hastily dug graves. A quick wooden cross might be fashioned from splintered boards, scrawled with a name if known, or simply unknown soldier if not. The next day's bombardment often obliterated these fresh burial sites, scattering remains yet again. Chemical weapon alerts kept everyone jittery. At the slightest whiff of a strange odor, soldiers fumbled for their gas masks, shouting warnings up and down the line. Sometimes it was just lingering smoke from a previous attack, but no one dared take chances. False alarms were common. Better to panic over nothing than die coughing up blood and bits of lung. Medics with bulging satchels rushed to treat those who failed to mask up in time. Their wide-eyed patients gasped, eyes swollen, faces twisted in agony. Others simply collapsed where they stood, never to rise again. Unusual artillery rounds appeared, loaded with propaganda leaflets that fluttered down over enemy trenches. The leaflets promised good treatment for anyone who surrendered, or boasted about certain victory for the side that launched them. Troops gathered these scraps of paper, scanning them by lantern light, snickering or spitting on the words. Sometimes, they saved a few for toilet paper or for lighting cigarettes in a pinch. A twisted game of psychological warfare played out, each side attempting to demoralize the other with flashy slogans and wild claims. Politicians toured the rear lines, wearing pristine uniforms and polished boots, making big speeches about courage and sacrifice. Actual frontline soldiers rarely saw them up close. When a high-ranking official did appear, accompanied by a staff of aides, the men cleaned trenches for the visit, arranged neat rows of equipment, and tried to act like conditions were under control. These visits lasted mere hours. The official would pose for photographs, maybe give a short pep talk, then vanish back to safer territory. Right after, the artillery hammered the area again, blowing apart all those tidied corners. It felt like a charade, fueling resentment among the rank and file. Feral dogs roamed bombed-out fields, scavenging scraps. Some turned vicious, attacking lone stragglers in the dark. Others bonded with certain units, following them around as unofficial mascots. Soldiers shared bits of rations with these canine companions who seemed as lost in the chaos as any human. If the dog got wounded, men tore up shirts to bandage its injuries. In that surreal environment, caring for an animal felt oddly grounding, a reminder that not everything was drenched in hatred. But the war was relentless. Even the friendliest hound risked stepping on mines or becoming collateral in random firefights. Soldiers often fantasized about real beds, hot meals, and quiet nights. The simplest comforts turned into fantasies of luxury. A private might rave for hours about the taste of fresh eggs, the crispness of newly laundered sheets, or the sensation of a long bath where the water stayed clean for more than a second. These daydreams could bring a flicker of warmth to cold nights. Some men claimed they'd never complain about chores or mundane tasks again if they could just escape this madness. Others vowed to travel the world after the war, see sunsets that weren't tinted by smoke, hear silence that wasn't shattered by shells. Mail remained a lifeline. Postcards with blurry photos of home arrived wrinkled, stained, sometimes weeks late. Families wrote about everyday events, crops, local dances, minor gossip. Reading these lines, soldiers smiled or teared up, momentarily transported away from the trenches. But the next shell blast reminded them where they really were. Return letters became a personal ritual, scribbled in battered notebooks or on scraps of packaging. Even if censors blacked out half the details, sending that letter felt like shouting, "I'm still here," across the void. When artillery quieted, the air itself felt heavy, as though bracing for the next round of devastation. Some men called this the death hush, a tense silence more disturbing than constant shell fire. In that hush, you heard dripping water, the shuffle of boots, maybe a distant cough. Everyone felt their nerves coil tight. Then, inevitably, a fresh barrage began, shaking the trench walls, flinging shards of shrapnel in deadly arcs. Dirt rained down. The cycle never seemed to end. Exhaustion etched deeper lines into every face. Eye sockets darkened, stubble grew unchecked, uniforms sagged on bodies worn thin by stress and malnutrition. Officers tried to keep discipline strong. They led inspections, demanded regular cleaning of rifles, even in the worst conditions. They punished stragglers or anyone who publicly questioned orders. But behind their stern demeanor, many officers were just as terrified as the men they commanded. Some shared their rations, offered words of sympathy, or took insane risks to lead from the front, earning the respect of their troops. Others stuck to rulebooks and shouted threats. Soldiers gossiped about which officers they'd follow into battle and which ones they'd happily ignore if the chance arose. Morale got a boost from rumors that a ceasefire might be discussed, but these stories often fizzled. One soldier overheard an officer say negotiations were underway in a fancy hotel far from the front. Another soldier claimed that a new superweapon would end the war in months. Hopes rose, only to crash when more offensives were launched or more lines got shelled to rubble. The uncertainty gnawed at everyone. Days dragged on, turning into weeks, then months. Seasons changed, but the war's grinding pace remained the same. Some units collected war trophies, enemy helmets, belt buckles, or flags. They stored them in corners of dugouts, showing them off like bizarre souvenirs from a grim vacation. Now and then, a soldier realized the helmet he'd picked up still had bits of hair or blood in it. That realization slapped them with the brutal truth behind trophies. Men tried to bury their revulsion, telling themselves it was just a part of war. But nightmares often featured those items, turning them into haunting symbols of how far from normal they'd drifted. Flooded trenches sometimes revealed pockets of hazardous chemicals left over from old gas attacks. Soldiers poked at suspicious puddles with sticks, watching for swirling rainbows or fumes. Their boots disintegrated if exposed too long. Hands itched, eyes watered. The ground itself seemed poisoned. A few got sick just from wading through certain areas. A dull fear set in. Even the soil had become an enemy, laced with toxins that lingered long after the shells stopped falling. This war didn't just kill, it tainted everything it touched. Electric wire patrols scouted at dusk, rolling out cables to improve communication lines. One spark of static could alert enemy snipers, so they moved like ghosts, footsteps muffled by rags wrapped around boots. The slightest slip brought a flash of rifle fire. Sometimes men rigged telephones in advanced listening posts, picking up even faint whispers from enemy trenches. This gave a crucial edge before raids or bombings. But whenever the lines crackled with static, hearts lurched, maybe a severed cable, or maybe a sabotage. Tension never eased. Mail sensors got ever stricter. Soldiers found entire paragraphs blacked out in letters from home, leaving confusing fragments like, "We all hope the soon, Father's orchard." No context. It drove them crazy trying to guess what had been removed. Maybe bad news, maybe harmless details. The censors aimed to protect morale by filtering out anything too upsetting. Men gritted their teeth. They wanted the truth, even if it hurt. But the system churned on, burying personal messages under thick layers of secrecy and red ink. Fresh attempts at aerial bombing saw entire squadrons dropping explosives on rail stations or supply dumps behind enemy lines. The rumble of those blasts echoed for miles. Some bombs missed and slammed into residential areas. This sparked public outrage, but the war machine rolled forward. Civilians caught in the crossfire were often labeled as unfortunate collateral damage. Soldiers at the front heard these stories, growing more numb with each tragic report. They wondered if their own homes might suffer the same fate. Anxiety gnawed at them, fueling an ever-deepening sense of despair. Underwater warfare also escalated, with submarines prowling shipping routes. Merchant vessels carrying food and ammo sank with horrifying regularity. Survivors floated for days in lifeboats, if they were lucky. Others vanished beneath the waves. Rumors of entire convoys disappearing without a trace rattled the front lines. Men worried about supplies never arriving, or worse, loved ones traveling on ocean liners that might become targets. The sense of a global conflict loomed large, no corner of the planet safe from this giant storm. Hospitals in the rear struggled with soldier after soldier returning from the front with shattered limbs, chronic coughing, or mental breakdowns. Nurses wrote letters begging for more supplies, bandages, medicine, even food. Overcrowding forced them to line beds along corridors. Sometimes men recovered physically, but woke every night drenched in sweat, screaming about artillery shells. Doctors called it neurasthenia, or shell shock, prescribing rest cures that rarely solved the deep-rooted trauma. Many just sat there, staring at walls, flinching at the slightest noise. Desperation led to bold plots. Commandos crept through enemy lines to blow up communication hubs or to capture a high-ranking officer. If successful, these raids earned massive praise, paraded in newspapers as heroic deeds. But if they failed, entire squads vanished in the dark, leaving behind scraps of gear and questions that never got answered. The psychological toll was immense. Volunteers stepped forward anyway, driven by the hope that one daring stroke might shorten the war, or at least earn them a chance to do something besides rot in muddy trenches. Fires raged in shell-blasted forests, devouring ancient trees and wildlife. Smoke blanketed miles of countryside, turning the sky an angry orange. Soldiers inhaled ash, coughed black phlegm, and shielded their eyes from drifting embers. Burned animals sometimes staggered out onto roads, horrifying passers-by. Everything about this war seemed intent on scarring the land for decades. The mere sight of a healthy green field felt like a mirage in a desert of destruction. When word spread that entire nations were nearing exhaustion, men looked at one another, longing for an end. But no one dared guess how or when that might happen. New alliances formed, old ones broke apart. Politicians bickered behind the scenes. Meanwhile, the guns roared on, demanding more lives. Soldiers joked bitterly that the trenches had become their permanent home. Every rumor of an armistice soon turned to dust, overshadowed by orders for the next big push. At times, bizarre discipline issues arose. Troops might riot over stale bread or contaminated water. MPs, military police, cracked down, dragging ringleaders to improvised stockades. One unit painted slogans demanding better rations on the trench walls, prompting furious reactions from higher command. But hunger gnawed at bellies, and scurvy or other deficiency diseases weakened entire sections of the army. Stomachs rumbled, tempers flared, yet the bullet exchange with the enemy never paused for these internal dramas. And still, each day blurred into the next. The cannonade thundered. Rifles chattered, men shouted for medics, and the wounded wept. Letters trickled in or got lost in the chaos. Filthy uniforms sagged on bony shoulders, eyes squinted at the horizon, searching for hope. Nighttime brought a fresh set of terrors, raids, silent kills, frantic messages. Sometimes the only comfort was a single cup of hot tea or coffee, shared among a few men in a half-collapsed dugout. Steam rose into the cold air, mingling with breath that smelled of desperation. This endless grind pushed everyone to the brink, testing courage, morality, sanity. From the highest-ranking general to the lowliest private, no soul emerged untouched. The war ground up hopes and spat them out in shell fragments across Europe's fields. Even if the roar of guns stopped tomorrow, the scars, physical and mental, would echo for generations. Yet in the swirling smoke and carnage, some spark of human warmth survived. A huddled group telling jokes, a soldier tucking a comrade's letter inside his own pocket for safekeeping, a makeshift band playing a battered tune as bombs fell in the distance. Those small sparks kept men going, day after day, in a world that seemed determined to drown out every last shred of murk.